皆さんこんばんは。私は影まりこと申します。日本で育ち、カナダに家族で移住してきました。Katwa alap in Chnuknukwa, Shinchas Mariko Kage, no hohotin in Shkai Shkusa, Nukwakwa Nahuit, Statlim Nahuit. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mariko Kage, and I was raised in Japan, and my 4 children are of the Statlium ancestry in the interior Salish tribe. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I represent the Japanese Canadian communities across Canada. Currently, I sit on the, was invited to join the committee of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, and in particular, the Human Rights Committee. And I am bilingual and bicultural. I came as a teen immigrant and went through the experience of cultural adjustment, culture shock, loss, and trauma. And I can relate to all immigrants from all over, what it's like to leave your home, family, place of comfort, place of familiarity, change of language. Over the years, I've experienced many multi-ethnic settings throughout my life as a parent, as a teacher, as a advocate and support workers in schools and communities. And I've also just want to start with the comments that I heard growing up in Japan that gave me an insight today. So a very dear elder that was known to us growing up in Japan had made a comment, you know, the Chinese are very dirty and greasy. And probably I would have been maybe 8 or 9 years old. And that comment stuck with me because it was just such an anomaly. Nothing like that have I ever heard before from my conversations with this elder. And it stuck with me. And later in my life, I realized that it comes from ignorance. It comes from also fear that especially in a monoracial country, that they're not familiar with seeing any foreigners. I got teased called an alien growing up as a mixed race kid in Japan, and I was a visible minority. So that's one thing that I'm aware that even with the people that I'm so familiar with, that I think are very good and good people, when the society around them or the propaganda sometimes from the government can affect the way we look at other people. Another comment came from a friend who said, "Oh, did you know so-and-so is part Korean? Oh, but don't say anything because you're not supposed to talk about it." And again, that was so shocking. I think I was maybe about 10 years old. And I said, what is that like for someone living in Japan and she can't be proud of her heritage, right? So all of this as a little, like a drop in the bucket in my childhood, I'm looking back and thinking, there was all that shame. What was it like for a girl who was part Korean who had to hide her identity? And so I really can sympathize with what people go through in that sense, because it was happening to my friend at the time. So over the last 19 years, I've been living and working in the traditional territory of the Statlium Nation, and I've really come to appreciate the impacts, the historical impacts, and how Indigenous families and individuals are still suffering from ongoing intergenerational trauma. And living and in addition, living in Lillooet currently for the last 12 years, I came to learn about a very interesting multicultural history that when I first moved for the first 3 years, no one talked about. No one knew about it, but this old heritage house was situated behind our post office, and it just sat there in a state of disuse and disrepair. And gradually, I was actually prompted by a friend of mine who co-founded the Miyazaki House Society. And I started to learn about the legacy of Dr. Masajiro Miyazaki, who was actually invested into the Order of Canada in 1977 for their contribution and services to Lillooet area region. But before that, in the 1940s, he was a doctor who went to great lengths to get his credentials because he was not allowed in any of the medical schools in Canada. So he had to work extra hard to earn extra money to apply for one university in I believe it was Kirkville College in Illinois, I believe, that took him in. So he came back to Canada, he set up his office in Japantown in Vancouver, and then soon after the war broke out, so his whole family, with him and his children, were moved to the Bridge River internment camp. So here was a doctor who was discriminated, and yet he was actually invited by the son of the Gold Commissioner of Lillooet, Caspar Fair, and his son's name was Artie Fair, who befriended Dr. Miyazaki because he was a doctor and Artie Fair was a coroner. He eventually invited Dr. Miyazaki to come and live in his heritage house because the town of Lillooet lost a doctor. And yet, although he served the town of Lillooet, he became the doctor to help the Indigenous people and also all of the people, over 1,000 people who were interned in the area. He was still not allowed to practice in the hospitals. He was not allowed to bring his clients to the hospital or in the clinic, in the local clinic. So hopefully maybe some of you who are interested would have a chance to look into and research your own history about Dr. Miyazaki, because it was through her daughter that I came to be made aware that there are no signage of all these internment camps throughout BC. And that led me to speaking with some of the local elders and learning more about the internment sites. And then with the help of the District of Lillooet, I was able to organize a project to make sure that the 3 internment camps were acknowledged in the area, namely East Lillooet, Minto Mines, and in Shalath, which is the former site of Bridge River. And and I think it was actually talking with the organizer of this event, Islam Unravelled, that when I was sharing my experience, I learned, and I was glad to have a conversation, that actually hiding history of the multicultural people that have contributed to this land, hiding or not acknowledging the history is also considered racism. So I wanted to share that with all of you as a thought. And moving forward, I do realize that I don't benefit from racism, and certainly none of the children who are Indigenous or ethnic. But the only reason that racism still exists today is because someone is benefiting from racism, and just something that maybe we can start thinking about. And the other issue is, what is cultural safety? Are Asian Canadians and Asian Americans, are they not feeling a loss of safety, especially in this current times? And as a mother of 4 Indigenous children, I ask, where does Indigenous people feel safe today? Do they feel safe to speak to the police? In the hospitals? Being pulled over by security officers? In educational settings? Do they feel safe to protest peacefully? Are there any places that Indigenous people feel safe? So to celebrate diversity and acknowledge this one day of elimination of racial discrimination is really wonderful. And I commend the organizers and the panelists and everyone who's come together. But that is probably the least that we can do. Could we instead think about what is the most that maybe we can do to end racism? How can we be part of the solution every single day? To me, every day is the end to racism. And every day we can look for the opportunities to be role models, especially for our children. Children are not born to be racist. Children are not born to point fingers and to exclude and to bully. They learn that from the world around them, especially from their adults around them. And so I think as adults, we can observe our own triggers, become hyper aware. Where do we feel the discomfort? What's going through our minds? And something that I learned from my father, putting together his book on redress and history of human rights, is that, look, why don't we look inside and see, who are we? What are our thoughts? How do we behave? Let's think about it. And look for the language of inclusivity and respect for all people, that the words that come out of our mouth, we need to be caretaking and be really aware, but also the nonverbal. We perform racism, we receive racism from body language, from eye contact, from gestures. And those are things that we need to have conversations with our children as educators and role models. So as my children are Indigenous, Japanese, and they're also from my mother's side, German, Irish and French from both their parents' side, and they also have Chinese ancestries, all of those ancestries. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity to be guiding children of let's say, Heinz 64, or a big mix of cultures. But I hope to see a world that is more inclusive and interconnected. In closing, as an Aikido instructor, I'd like to share a teaching from the founder of Aikido, Morihei Ueshiba, who said, "Extend loving protection to all living things," which is about kindness. 皆さんどうもありがとうございました。Kukstum kalap. Takam ich nuknukwa, all my relations. Thank you very much.